Namaste and welcome to everyone joining us today, the 26th of February 2026. My name is Sanjay Kucheria, and on behalf of the Sanatan Dharma Group, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this session. Our ongoing effort through these dialogues is to engage deeply with questions that shape civilizational understanding, historical memory, and cultural confidence. Before we begin, a quick housekeeping note. This session is being recorded. We will have a Q&A segment toward the end of the talk, and audience questions can be submitted using the questions feature at the bottom of your Zoom app at any time during the session. Few subjects have generated as much discussion, disagreement, and reinterpretation as the question of Indo-European origins and their relationship to the Indian subcontinent. The Aryan invasion theory emerged in the 19th century as an attempt to explain linguistic similarities between Sanskrit and European languages by proposing a migration or invasion of Indo-European speaking groups into the Indian subcontinent. This investigation intersects with identity, language, archaeology, genetics, education policy, and global academic discourse. Over time, this theory has evolved, been challenged, and reinterpreted in light of new archaeological, linguistic, and genetic evidence, leading to continuing debate about its assumptions and conclusions. In today's session, we will look at the origins of the debate, the development of various theories, and current scholarly landscape of this theory. It is an honor to have with us Amritanshu Pandey. Amritanshu is the co-founder of Bodh, a research group and think tank dedicated to civilizational inquiry and intellectual engagement. He brings a decade and a half of professional experience in product development and business leadership with a lifelong engagement in ancient Indian history and civilizational thought. He writes extensively on history, design, and civilizational frameworks, and currently serves as a research fellow under the Sir Jadunath Sarkar Fellowship for Indian History at FIHCR. He's also the author of Fractal Mandala, A History of Ancient India, along with a series of historical fiction novels that bring India's past into narrative form. Amritanshu, thank you for being with us today. We invite you to take us through your presentation and help us understand this whole Aryan issue. Over to you.
Namaste. Thank you, Sanjay ji, and good evening to everyone who's joined the call. I'll just share my desktop and yeah, is it visible?
Yes, it is.
Great. All right, so Sanjay ji has already given a coverage of what we are here for today. I've titled it the Aryan issue because as we will see, Aryan invasion, Aryan migration, there are other less flattering terms for that entire model as well. So overall, it's an issue that we wish to understand. And it's a coverage of the question of the Aryan issue, which is essentially a question of what we call proto-Indo-European origins and dispersals. And while, yes, I will indeed submit to what my own positions on this matter are and front some of those positions today, but my primary objective is to actually give a relatively objective coverage of the matter, which means that what I want to highlight is not necessarily one particular theory or one particular way of looking at this. What I want to highlight are some objectively applicable issues on this matter, which would be true and which would be salient regardless of what position we take. So whether we think it was an invasion, a migration, whether we think they came to India or left from India, whatever be our view or whatever model we wish to subscribe to, there would be some general axioms, some general truths which would hold true in all cases. And so that's my primary objective, though of course, yes, I will present a certain point of view as well. So to begin on Aryan invasion / migration, there are other names for it as well. The first thing to understand, what is it? What is this model and what does it tell us? Very broadly speaking and somewhat reductively speaking, what this model tells us is that after 2000 BCE, which means 4026 years ago, after that period, tribes of Indo-European speakers, which means people who spoke Indo-European languages of some kind, tribes of Indo-European speakers and these languages or whatever they spoke was a precursor to Sanskrit. They invaded or migrated into India from the northwest. And with them, they therefore brought their language, their culture, and this language and this culture they then imposed, or maybe it got diffused, maybe it trickled down into the local population of the Indian subcontinent at the time, such that it gave rise to what we today know as the Vedic civilization, the Vedic culture. So this is broadly the model at hand. And once again, initially when this model was proposed, it was an invasion model. We should remember that when this model was first proposed, the cities of Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, the Indus Valley were not yet discovered. So at the time when this model was first proposed, the earliest that we took Indian history or history in the Indian subcontinent was to the Mauryas, to Gautam Buddha, and maybe a few centuries prior to that. We had no clue that there was also something like the Indus Valley civilization. Nonetheless, a model was proposed at the time of an invasion that elite males and those, we might be familiar with those stereotypical images on horses, on chariots. These were dominant warrior elite. They came into India and they invaded the local population. They dominated and conquered the local population and then imposed their culture. However, it was over time realized that the invasion model did not hold water, because what we would have to then say is that a very small group of males or elite warriors were able to somehow impose their entire culture and characteristics of their culture on what was the demographic heavyweight, which was the Indian subcontinent. And calling it an invasion became even tougher once the cities of Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Indus Valley, Saraswati Valley started making themselves known. And then this became a deeper problem. So then we called it a migration, that, okay, yes, they did not conquer, they did not dominate per se, they migrated here. And then somehow their culture, their language diffused. There are recent theories, recent models also, which I quote, say that a single Afghan tribe in the winter might have interned in Punjab. A single Afghan tribe might have interned in Punjab one winter and spread the entire Aryan kit to the subcontinent. So those of us who are skeptical of that kind of model, we call it the Aryan tourism theory, that perhaps it's through tourism that the matter was spread. However, that is the theory in broad. Now, the first thing to understand, this theory is linguistic at heart, which means, what are we talking about? We are talking about the fact that from Iceland in Europe to India, there are groups of languages, language families, that we have noticed have filial relationships to each other. Greek, Italic, Germanic, Balto-Slavic, some extinct language families as well, Anatolian, Tocharian, Hittite, Iranian, and Indo-Aryan. And these language families, we found that they had enough relationships between each other to posit that they all descended from a mother language. And since these were the Indo-European languages, the mother language was therefore called proto-Indo-European, or PIE. So that is actually the core model at hand, that there must have been some language which we are nominally calling proto-Indo-European, or PIE. That language then gave rise to its daughter languages and daughter language families, and somehow, presumably, must have spread from wherever its origins were, such that then we find the Indo-European languages from Iceland to India. This is a linguistic theory, and it rests on a central assumption of a single proto-language, which is proto-Indo-European, and it also rests on the assumption that it must have been in one isolated single homeland, that it must have had some point zero or Big Bang event, some origin event. This is the core theory at hand. Therefore, we can understand that actually, whether we call it Aryan invasion, migration, what have you, it is actually not the base theory. It is a corollary. It is a base theory. It is a downstream of the base theory, which is the theory on the origins and dispersals of proto-Indo-European. And from the Indian point of view, if we place a point X anywhere on the Eurasian landmass as the origin of PIE, if that point X is outside India, we are by definition implying some kind of invasion migration scenario. And conversely, if we put that point X somewhere within the Indian subcontinent, then we would presumably have to argue for an out of India model, But in either case, the question we're dealing with is the question of the origin and the dispersals of proto-Indo-European. That is the matter at heart. It is therefore a subset of the larger PIE origins question. And please notice some of these assumptions that are immediately built in the moment we ask that who were the people that spoke PIE? When did they speak it? And where did they live? If we ask these questions, we are already assuming a few things. We are assuming that this PIE culture is some kind of arbitrary mother culture. Because if we know that Indo-European cultures are somehow descended from PIE culture, how do we know that PIE might itself not have descent and influence from its own mother cultures? So where do we arbitrarily put a line and say this is the origin point? After all, before PIE would have been proto-PIE of some kind. And indeed, in the world of languages, there are already theories such as the Nostratic language theory, which talks about a super unity of Indo-European languages, Afro-Asiatic languages, Semitic languages, Cynic languages, and so on. So where is the origin point? And how do we know that this is the point where the culture, the theology, the rituals, the languages actually originated? How do we put that point somewhere? Number two, it also assumes an isolated and singular contiguous homeland. Because the moment we say that, okay, where did they live and how do we identify that land? We are somehow assuming that that land would have one homogeneous nature, which would be PIE, that we would be able to identify PIE, the language, through some kind of archaeology of that land, through some kind of paleontology of that land. So these are assumptions that are built into the system. And we are also, of course, assuming an utter congruence of language and culture. That somehow, if there was a proto-Indo-European language, then that means there must have been a proto-Indo-European culture, and that these two must have moved together and descended together into different parts of the world. So these are the core assumptions that are built into this model. And again, it is regardless of where in Eurasia we put that point X, whether we put it in India, whether we put it outside, whatever we posit, these assumptions hold true. And this fundamental hypothesis of a proto-Indo-European mother language, that holds true for wherever we put the point X. Now, just in case I begin to sound very skeptical about proto-Indo-European, let us give some credence to the field of comparative linguistics. How do we know that these language families are related? Look at one very common example. So this is an example of the words for our close family terms, father, mother, brother, sister, in some common languages, English, Latin, Greek, Dutch, and Sanskrit. And you can see the remarkable similarity. The English mother is the Sanskrit matra. The English father is the Sanskrit pitra. The English brother, bhratra, sister, swastra, son, sunu, daughter, duhitra. And yes, there are some differences in some cases, like Latin has filius and filia, but overall the pattern holds such that these language families seem to have similar words for some of the earliest words that humanity must have used. After all, mother and father are the two words every human being learns the earliest. And presumably, if the family is bigger, then they learn words for brother and sister. And as we grow older and move into the next stage of our lives, we learn the words for son and daughter. So these are the most core and close words to human existence. And they are so similar across all of these language groups. Therefore, we posit that these languages must be coming from some kind of origin, some kind of root source. And that root source is therefore Proto-Indo-European. Another example of this similarity is in the theonyms or the words for gods. And this is where we again also start working with that assumption that the linguistic congruence also implies some kind of cultural congruence. And this is in fact true when we compare the names of gods across these languages. So the Sanskrit Agni is attested in Latin as Ignis, in Lithuanian as Ugnis. The Sanskrit Ashwin has its cognates in Equus, Asva, Epona. Dios, very famously, Dios Pitra is Zeus Pater, is Jupiter. So these commonalities again indicate that these language families are descending from some kind of common source. And that is in fact the model. That is what gives rise to this entire Aryan issue. So who were these people who spoke PIE? Where did they live? And how did they disperse in what ways from that homeland such that their daughter languages are now found across Eurasia? Now, this search for the PIE homeland, the landscape of it is such that though we may have already read in textbooks and there are some more mainstream than other models which tell us that oh they originated in the Pontic steppe or they originated in the Caucasus, but in fact over time, over the decades, all kinds of homelands have been proposed and there is no particular consensus per se. So, for example, the Caucasus, just south of the Caspian Sea, just north of the Caspian Sea, Pontic Steppe, Anatolia, which is Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, India. At the far fringe of this, for example, the Nazis wanted it to be somewhere in the Nordic area. Our own famous Tilakji, he actually purported a homeland in the North Pole, near the North Pole. So there are various theories on the table here. Now, of course, pointing this out is not a way to discard the model completely. So I've shown that table previously that yes, indeed, there can be a linguistic unity between these families. But that question of where the homeland is far from settled. And there are indeed even now various different options on the table. So refuting this Aryan invasion or Aryan migration model is not actually an exercise in nationalism or chauvinism. This is commonly portrayed. The moment we start showing skepticism or or rejecting the fundamentals of this model, it is said that oh, you are being nationalistic, or you are being maybe Hindu chauvinistic, etc. That is not our motivation here. The truth should stand on its own, and if it does, we have actually no problem with admitting to it or with conceding it. So this entire question, but because of these assumptions outside the linguistic boundaries, that there must have been a cultural congruence, there must have been some archaeological congruence, this question then begins to inflate and go beyond the academic contours of linguistics and comparative linguistics to touch genetics, archaeology, ethnicity, and these disciplines have then accumulated around that linguistic kernel. In the latest models, there is a hybrid model that is proposed by the Max Planck Institute in 2023. It actually talks about two homelands, an initial center of origin or innovation, and a later center of dispersal. That's a very common pattern, actually. We will see other theories also that do rely on that kind of pattern. And it says that these two centers are the south of the Caucasus and the Pontic Steppe. But there is also a model by Johanna Nichols, which came out in 2020 or 2018, I believe, which posits the Bactria sogdiana area, which is roughly northern Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan area, and some parts of Iran. So her model posits that as the purported homeland. So these are some of the later developments on models. Now, when we have this idea of proto-Indo-European, one of the primary works in comparative linguistics is to reconstruct proto-Indo-European. So, for example, we looked at this table here. If we know that these are the words for mother in the current Indo-European languages, then comparative linguistics, the way the field works and its technical dimensions, it tries to reconstruct that what would the word for mother have been in PIE, in Proto-Indo-European itself. So that is the exercise of reconstructing Proto-Indo-European. On this, the Bible text or the seminal text is the Oxford Guide to PIE and PIE Origins by Mallory and Adams. It's a big fat tome, which is a very technical deep dive into the entire matter of PIE, PIE reconstruction, and so on. There they say that reconstructed PIE actually tells us remarkably little about the precise homeland. And it says that not very informative concerning the physical environment. So what do we mean by this? When they reconstruct PIE, they come up with certain words that these words must have existed in PIE. And if those words existed in PIE, it tells us something about the PIE people. So for example, there are reconstructed words for the wheel in PIE. What that tells us is that at the time that the wheel was invented, PIE was one linguistic composite group. That means that its split and dispersal into the daughter languages happened after the wheel was invented. That is how there is a reconstructed or word for wheel in PIE. Similarly, those words for the family groups, it tells us that at the time of the PIE unity, the family structure was already in place because words for mother, father, sister, daughter, son, brother, they were already in place. And the split happened after this was already done. So when we do these kind of things, we try to get some hints about the PIE world. So for example, we know that the PIE people were somewhat familiar with ice and snow. We know that they were familiar with animals like the horse, animals like the wolf. But then if this is the condition, then let's try to think of, what areas from Iceland to India might this not apply to? You could say that pretty much from Iceland to India, the entire stretch, people would be familiar with ice and snow. Even in India, the Himalaya are never far away. So the very name for Himalaya tells us that we're very familiar with snow and ice. So goes for the Caucasus, so goes for Europe. So it doesn't help us, filter out any area. Similarly, animal like the wolf is common across Eurasia. So because of these reconstructions, Mallory and Adams in their tome say that it tells us very little about the physical environment because we're unable to filter out areas per se. Further, PI reconstruction itself changes over the centuries. So, for example, there is a famous tale, it's called Schleicher's tale. It was first written out in 1868, which says that a sheep that had no wool saw horses. And Schleicher's reconstructed version of this, that how would this sentence be written in proto-Indo-European, was avis jasmin varna na ast dadarka akvams. But the latest reconstruction by Adams in 1997, I do not even know how to pronounce it, but you can see for yourself the drastic change that has happened in the same sentence. So the field itself is evolving, it's changing, and certitudes are not really merited. The PI climate reconstruction, similarly, it tells us very little to where the proto-Indo-Europeans lived. And so linguistic conclusions are inherently circular. When the data is filtered, we work with assumptions. So for example, the entire theory about the Yamnaya culture, if you've heard of it being this some kind of a proto-Indo-European homeland, it's built upon a circular theory that there must have been chariots in the proto-Indo-European world. And so then where you find chariots, you say that therefore this is the homeland. But the question about chariots itself is changing. So for example, now it seems to us that the proto-Indo-European people were only familiar with rudimentary wagons and that the chariot was independently then invented in its daughter streams much later. So it's an example of how the landscape is changing. Once again, calling this out is not to say that this entire field is to be dismissed. So people on the other side, when they try to create straw man arguments, to these kind of points, they say that, oh, so you are, doubting the validity of linguistic paleontology, you're doubting the entire field of comparative linguistics. That is not the case. So as equally as we can point to uncertainties in string theory and quantum physics, and yet not dismiss the field of physics, similarly, we can at least point out that certainties are not being warranted in this field without actually dismissing the field itself. So in that book, Mallory and Adams, this quote is a key takeaway. A solution to the IE, Indo-European problem, will more than likely be as dependent on a re-examination of the methodology and terminology as much as on the actual data themselves. So this should tell us that we must be circumspect when we find people or when we find works that are dealing with great certainty that, yes, this is for sure the way it happened. So that is what I wanted to point out in this. Now, what about the work on our side? What about counter theories? What about rejections, debunkings? So one very common trend you find is that whenever there are people working from this side, trying to either find issues in logical issues in PIE and PIE models or Aryan invasion migration models, they're immediately accused of revisionism, that you are being a history revisionist. Now look at how the language itself works. First of all, what is the problem in revisionism? After all, if something is wrong, we would have to revise it. But this word revisionism is used in a way to impute an agenda, an a priori agenda, that your entire enterprise is not actually an intellectual and objective and academic enterprise. It is an enterprise colored with the agenda of revising history. That is an accusation frequently heard. Another one is of indigenism. So this is hurled at Indian theorists who reject the PIE model or who reject Aryan invasion models, that you are being indigenist, that you are not able to stomach the idea of anything coming from outside, and therefore that is motivating your entire enterprise. So this is a good way to actually already label someone and rather avoid dealing with the merits of their argument. My point is that actually, on the other side, the people who do this are reputationists because decades, if not more, of university careers, tenures, books, speaking assignments, global reputation have been built on the current established, not questioned models. And so the people who have to preserve those models or who have built their careers on those models have their entire reputation built on top of it. So my counterpoint is that if the people who are debunking this or who are countering this are indigenists or revisionists, then the people who are dogmatically sticking to it are reputationists. And that's just a way to show that we can play this label game all day long, but it prevents us from actually reaching the points and the merits of either argument. There is a typical playbook the reputationist employs. What does that playbook look like? Number one, as I said, you discredit the agenda. So people who work with OIT, which is out of India, for example, are labeled as indigenist or revisionist, and that itself suffices to discredit them in global academic circles and conferences. You attack the author and the author's credentials. So Shrikant Talagariji, who is a scholar on the Indic side, it's often pointed out that, oh, he's just a bank clerk. So credentialism is brought in. Dr. Nicholas Kazanas, who is a Greek himself, it is argued that he does not properly understand Greek. So again, the arguments are not being countered against, rather credentialism and ad hominem attacks are made more easily. There is also a lot of pedantic undermining where you nitpick smaller points to show, as if the author doesn't know what they're talking about, but you ignore the larger issues at play. That this happened to Shrikant Talageri as well. Shrikant Talageri, for example, famously uses a certain chronology of the Rig Veda, an internal chronology of the Rig Veda that is well established in Indology and consensus circles. But despite that, other points and less important points to his argument are picked up and then nitpicked. But the fact that he's already working with an established and agreed upon internal chronology is not addressed or it's ignored. Data is falsified as well. Michael Witzel, a famous Indologist and worker in this field, scholar in this field, he's been caught fabricating evidence more than once. And I have looked at this and its incidences in the Rig Veda myself, where specific Rig Veda mantras, what it says and what Witzel claims it says are absolutely different. Any one of us can look at any translation of the Rig Veda, even in English. We don't even actually need to know Sanskrit to know how he fabricates information at times. And then they deny all non-linguistic evidence. So any evidence from horses, from fire altars, from Saraswati, the river, that would then force the linguistic assumptions to be questioned are summarily dismissed. So this is a typical reputationist playbook. What we do have to understand from an Indian point of view, or rather from any point of view, it is not enough to simply refute or debunk Aryan invasion migration theory. Why? Because as I said, it is a corollary. It is downstream of the original theory, which is this notice of a linguistic unity in Indo-European languages, and therefore a hypothesis that there must have been something like proto-Indo-European. Now, unless we want to, of course, dismiss that entire hypothesis itself, I don't. As I showed you some tables, there are legitimate reasons to argue for a linguistic family group and a mother group, a mother language to all of these languages, that theory itself does hold water. But if it does hold water, we can't just say, no, Aryan invasion didn't happen, Aryan migration didn't happen. We would have to give some kind of legitimate argument for where was the homeland. So as Conrad Elst G says, a great scholar in this field, that the existence of Indo-European languages in Europe, in Turkey, has to be explained. So even if we say that no, Aryan invasion theory was not true, we would then have to explain, well, where did PI originate and how did it reach all those other places? And that enterprise then is, of course, what we would call the out of India theory or OIT. So that's just a bit of the landscape on what kind of motivations are involved, what kind of allegations are involved, what kind of issues are involved in this. And that takes us to out of India. On the global stage, a great deal of effort has actually been put down to establish how India cannot be the homeland. And this is very curious because you do not find this kind of effort for anywhere else. For example, it's not like too many scholars have tried to prove how Iran can't be the homeland, or how Turkey can't be the homeland, or how Greece can't be the homeland. But lots of effort has gone into proving that no, India cannot be the homeland. And the flip side of this, that if this PIE theory is true, and as I said, that yes, we are okay to subscribe to it, and if we place a point X somewhere in Eurasia, then the fact is that from there, Indo-European linguistic descendants spread to India, spread to Iran, spread to Greece, spread to Italy, spread to all of modern Germany and France, spread to Scandinavia. So if that is true, then if the Vedic civilization has foreign influences, then so does the Greek civilization, so does the Roman civilization, so do the Anglo-Saxons, so do the Vikings. But notice that nowhere else in the world or in Eurasia is there so much noise on trying to constantly remind people in the current populace that no, some of you are descended from invaders, from outsiders. So Romila Thaparji has famously written a book called Which of Us Are Aryans? And the fact is that if the PI theory is true, then this question can be asked in Germany, it can be asked in Greece, it can be asked in Sweden, in Norway. But in those places, this doesn't happen. Why? Because in those places, it is taken as a linguistic and academic theory. It is only in India that it yields divisiveness to the extent that even today, we take Aryan and Dravidian or invader and Adivasi or Brahminical and Dalit or lower caste or Northern Indian and Southern Indian, and all of these binaries are without question just mapped onto this binary of invaders, Aryan invaders who came to India, and some kind of indigenous population that was then conquered or whose local culture was then taken over by the Aryan culture. So even if this theory is true, then we should go ahead and tell the Greeks also that yes, you are also a foreign civilization. So the Greeks, the Iranians are either as foreign as the Vedics or they're as indigenous as the Vedics. We have to take a decision regardless of where we put the point X on Eurasia. So this goes back to what I started with, that I want to more highlight some objective points which are true regardless of our position on the matter. And if our position on the matter is that we will cast divisions and beyond academic questions in the Indian populace today on the basis of this theory, it should be done in Greece as well. It should be done in Italy as well. It should be done in Germany as well, in Turkey as well, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't happen. So that should tell us that in India, this theory has really exceeded its academic and linguistic boundaries, where we can be fascinated by it. Linguistics is an amazing field. These comparisons of, Zeus Pater, Dios Pitra, how fascinating that these connections can be found between ancient cultures. But we are not allowed to just do that. We have to then start dealing with things like, no, some of you are Brahmins, some of you are Adivasis. Ironically, those who we call Adivasis are linguistic entrants into India much later, actually, in the last maybe 1,000, 1,500 years. Further, there is also the question of how these people connect to the Indus Valley civilization. And you can imagine when the Indus Valley civilization was discovered, when Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were first discovered, the Aryan invasion theory was already in place. So there's that famous quote that, they found some remains in Mohenjo-daro and the archaeologists said that Indra stands accused. Which was a reference to somehow now Indra was read as a city breaker and conqueror in the Rig Veda. The landscape there has changed, thankfully. For example, Colin Renfrew, a more recent scholar, has said that there is absolutely no reason to actually think of the Harappans and the Vedics as different people. And indeed, we have, of course, now found that what we were calling the Indus Valley civilization is now more accurately the Sindhu Saraswati civilization or Saraswati Sindhu civilization, either way. In fact, more of its cities and urban clusters were on the now dried riverbank of Saraswati. And the Sindhu was actually a frontier territory. The Saraswati was the core territory. That is indeed what is said of the Vedic people as well. In the Rig Veda, they laud the Saraswati River as Giribhya Asamudrat, from mountains to the sea, as Nadi Tame Ambi Tame, as the mother of all rivers, the greatest of all rivers. So they were verily the same people, in fact. And we've been treating them as different people because of the legacy of an established viewpoint. There is also the question of the Dravidian language families, the Southern Indian languages. And funnily enough, even for this, there are migration models. So there are scholars who would argue that even the Dravidian families originated somewhere in Iran, somewhere. Some argue in modern Tajikistan, Uzbekistan area, and that they also came into India. There is a famous model by Asko Parpola that says that there was first wave was the Dravidian speakers who came into India. And then a few centuries or maybe even up to a millennium after them, the Indo-European speakers also came and they pushed the Dravidian language speakers further south. So it's funny that for the subcontinent, which has been a demographic heavyweight all along across known world history, for the subcontinent where the Indus Valley or Sindhu Saraswati civilization was twice larger in size than its contemporaries Egypt and Mesopotamia put together. So you could sum up their areas and double its area. That was the extent of the Sindhu Saraswati civilization. And yet, there are people who find it comfortable and valid to argue that everything, though, just came into the Indian subcontinent and everything is from outside, from foreign. But yes, there is the question of the Dravidian homeland. At least from an Indian point of view, if we are going to be looking at Indo-European languages and their history, we would have to look at Dravidian languages and their history as well, and understand how they interacted and commingled with each other through history. There is the issue of selective linguistic paleontology. Linguistic paleontology, I've given you a few examples where you reconstruct PIE to get some sense of what climate were they familiar with, what animals were they familiar with. And this is actually an exercise only in selective bias, because whatever homeland a scholar wants to posit, they focus on those paleontological reconstructions that qualify that homeland exclusively. For India, well, there are linguistic reconstructions that show that the PIE people were familiar with wolf, as I mentioned, with ice, with the elephant, and with the monkey, and with the lion. Now, across Eurasia, actually, if you want to find one geography where elephants, wolves, lions, and monkeys are all found, there's no geography outside of India or the Indian subcontinent. But it's an exercise in selective bias. All sides do it, including sides that may want to posit out of India as well. For out of India, there are partial models by Dr. Nicholas Kazanas, Dr. Konrad Elst. These are non-Indians, mind you. Alexander Semenenko, he's a Russian. Konrad Elst is a Belgian. Kazanasji is a Greek. So even indigenism cannot be now argued for them because these are non-Indians who are still arguing for some kind of origin scenario in the Indian subcontinent. There's also partial work done on this by Subhash Kakji. But there are complete models for out of India. By complete, I mean that within themselves, they give a complete model for the origin and dispersal of PIE and its daughter languages from India, from the Indian subcontinent. And famously by Shrikant Talageri and by a Russian scholar, Igor Tonoyan Belyayev. Both of them have worked independently. Neither of them use each other's arguments or evidences. So actually you have two separate lines of evidence arguing, giving a complete model of out of India. Some important things that put the out of India model into give favor to the out of India model. One is the preservation principle. Very simply put, it's a principle articulated by Kazanasji that the people or culture that has preserved the most has moved the least. Very simple principle. Why? Because people on the move for long periods tend to lose elements of their culture through issues in transmission of knowledge, transmission of information. When people are migrating over generations and centuries, then you can imagine that less and less gets transmitted from parent to child and so on. Maybe grandparents are unable to even work with their grandchildren. That also then impedes cultural transmission. So their language suffers changes as they interact with other cultures. On this principle, Sanskrit scores the highest among all IE languages because it retains the most amount of archaic roots, stems, and theonyms. And if we try to look at this principle for other purported homelands, for example, the Pontic steppe, well, Baltic and Slavic, they show far greater erosion, though they are still there in the purported homeland of the Pontic steppe. So, which doesn't make sense, it's counterintuitive. And so Kazanasji says, Vedic is a language which in most respects is more archaic and less altered from the original Indo-European. Once again, I'll show you this table. So you can see it is only in Sanskrit that actually we have a very complete theonym set or names of gods. So for example, in Greek, Agni is missing, Marut are missing, Parjanya is missing. In Latin, there are many names missing. In Baltic, actually only a few exist. In Celtic, Mitanni, Lithuanian, only a few exist. But in Sanskrit, the entire theonym set is still attested. So applying the preservation principle, this tells us that these people who had this entire theonym set would presumably have moved the least, would presumably have faced the least amount of issues and obstacles in cultural transmission, whereas the others must have moved a lot. That's why they were not able to preserve the entire theonym set. Whatever models we work on for Proto-Indo-European origin and dispersals, broadly, there are three dispersal events that are posited. The first is dispersal of the language groups that are known as Anatolian and Tocharian. They are extinct language groups. We know them only through some attestations. And in fact, Anatolian, it's frequently argued, might even be a sister to Proto-Indo-European, so not a daughter of Proto-Indo-European. Another example of how the landscape changes. But the current models work with first, at whatever stage, wherever PIE existed, first, some people must have separated who were the linguistic precursors of those that later spoke Anatolian and Tocharian. Then a few centuries elapsed, and so Proto-Indo-European continued to evolve in its homeland till a second dispersal happened. And the linguistic precursors of the Italic, Celtic, Germanic, Baltic, and Slavic groups, they then migrated in the second dispersal. And then there is a third and final dispersal, which is when the Albanian, Greek, Armenian, Iranian, and Indo-Aryan, which is our northern Indian Sanskritic language families, they then finally dispersed from the original homeland. But between these three dispersal events, many, many centuries, maybe up to millennia, might have passed, which means that the Proto-Indo-European, that the third dispersal split from, would have already been very different to the Proto-Indo-European that a first dispersal split from, because that itself would have continued to evolve. So you can see that in reality, how dynamic is this matter compared to with what kind of certitudes the history has been told to us on the basis of this. Now, both Talageri and Tonoyan Belyayev, their own out-of-India models satisfy these dispersal events. Talageri works primarily with linguistic and textual evidence, Tonoyan Belyayev with linguistic and archaeological evidence, but both their models are well compatible with these dispersal events and with the timelines and absolute dates that are date bands that are usually given for these dispersal events. There are other things, other origin and migration patterns to also consider in this. For example, the archaeological evidence in Anatolia, which is Turkey and Indo-Iran, it places the transition to animal husbandry and organized agriculture between the 7th and 5th millennia BCE. But if these things originated with the Proto-Indo-European people, the Proto-Indo-European timeline is put to somewhere, 4000 BCE. So these things happened way too earlier for that timeline to be compatible with this. So it's just one instance of how we have to work with a lot of different dates, a lot of different evidences. We know that in the Indian subcontinent, there was independent origin of agriculture and animal husbandry. In Mehergarh, we know there was independent barley cultivation developed. In Lahura Deva, which is 100 kilometers west of Ayodhya, we know that rice cultivation was independently developed. Year-round irrigation was independently developed, and animal husbandry, domestication of the cow, of other equid animals as well. And then there are east to west migrations that we know are attested in other ways. For example, the Bos indicus, the Indian cow, has no genetic influx of Bos taurus or the taurine cow, the European cow. But the Bos taurus has a genetic influx of Bos indicus, which means that the cow genetics tell us that Bos indicus did go to Europe, but Bos taurus never came to India. So now if we're trying to argue that the Proto-Indo-European people, they came to India, they brought their animals, their culture, their technologies, it would be special pleading to say that no, but they didn't come with their cows somehow. And after they came, then Indian cows magically went to Europe. A similar problem with the mouse. The domestic mouse, its origins have been traced to India. And we find that it started and originated from India and then spread to the Middle East, to Sumer, Mesopotamia, etc., those areas. Well, the domestic mouse, it follows food grains and granaries. It's not a nomadic wild animal. It lives with human habitations. It moves with human movement. So if it started in India, originated in India, and moved to the Middle East, then again, that attests a lot of human movement from India to the West. And similarly, when we find motifs like the swastik, etc., similar patterns are noticeable. Now, in the words of Conrad Elschi, Srikant Talageri has single-handedly won the debate. And I personally do subscribe to that. What Talageri ji has done, I mean, it's a whole body of work, but some of his clinchers. He looks at the internal Rigvedic chronology, which is an Indological consensus, by the way. In fact, from the traditional Indian or Hindu point of view, there is no Rigvedic chronology, right? Because the Vedas are considered Aparushya, Anadi, and it is considered almost taboo from a traditional point of view to look at a dating or chronology of the Rigveda. So it's an Indological and established mainstream scholarly consensus on what parts of the Rigveda are said to be earlier and what parts of the Rigveda are said to be later. And what Talageri finds that if we divide those two parts into an early Rigveda and later Rigveda, then in the early Rigveda, the people are familiar with the geography, the climate, and the flora and fauna of broadly modern Uttar Pradesh and Western Delhi, Meerut, etc. area. And it's only in the second half, or the latter half of the Rigveda, that they become familiar with Punjab, Afghanistan area. Now, this clearly evidences an east to west movement. If the people were coming from the west, then in the earlier parts of the text, they would be familiar with that geography. And it's only in the later parts of the text that they would become familiar with the UP part of the geography, Uttar Pradesh part of the geography. But we find a converse pattern. So that's one example of how Talageri finds literature and textual evidence to actually show us that the Vedic people were very much in their homeland, and what their homeland was probably northern India. His internal chronology, it shows geographic, linguistic, genealogical indicators that are consistent with a westward expansion from India. Similarly, we have evidence from the Zend Avesta, which is the text of the Zoroastrians. It's actually Zend Avesta is the anglicization. If you want to say it in Sanskrit, it's Chand Avastha, where Chand is exactly what it means, meter. All Rigvedic mantras are set in a meter as well. The dialectical similarities between Sanskrit and Avestan, they're so similar that in many Rigvedic mantras, you could just make one or two sound changes and you would get the mantra of the Zend Avesta instead. For example, the S sound in Sanskrit is the H sound in Avestan. This is why Sindhu became Hindu. This is why those that are called the Dasas in the Rigved are the Dahas in the Zend-Avesta. This is why the Asur becomes the Ahur in the Zend-Avesta. And there are other issues as well. But both texts very clearly show these to be one people, one linguistic group that come into some kind of political and cultural conflict with each other. So these are not two separate or alien populations. These are not populations who previously did not know each other and have suddenly come into contact and competition. They are very much the same people of similar origins. And the Iranians in the Rigved are attested in modern Punjab. So once again, if we want to argue that these Aryans or proto-Indo-Europeans, they came to India from outside, then that model would say that the Iranians split somewhere, let us say in Afghanistan and Tajikistan, and went towards Iran. And then the Indians came into Punjab. So what were the Iranians doing in Punjab, as this textual evidence shows? So these are some examples of how there is a very rigorous and well-built model for out of India as well. And it is well merited by other scholars as well, for example, Igor Tonoyan Belyayev, etc. One final point, which is on genetics, because this is the latest entrant to the field. And we are actually often told of something called the Aryan gene as well. But before we get there, we need to understand the utter incongruence of language, culture, and genetics. They do not move the same way all the time. For example, English, we are all interacting in English here, but we don't have British genes. Similarly, a religion has spread from the Middle East to across the world, but without transmission of Arabian genes. Chess, Buddhism, Sanskrit, these are cultural elements that spread across Asia, for example, without the spread of genes. So these are examples of how you cannot assert a correspondence and congruence in the movement of genetics, language, and culture. There are enough examples of how they move in very different ways. But we are still told that there is an haplogroup, which is now called the Aryan gene, that R1A, and it came into India after 1500 BCE. This is hard evidence. So here is where genetics is a hard science. We do know indeed that yes, this haplogroup begins to show imprint in the Indian gene pool after 1500 BCE. But we should ask ourselves, what did they bring? How are we already assuming that these were Aryans bringing Vedic culture, unless there is tautology at play? Because in the Indian archaeology, we already have fire altars from much before. We have the Saraswati River much before. We have now in Sinoli, 1900 BCE, chariots much before. So clearly, these people did not bring anything which could be a precursor to the Vedic culture. And indeed, in the Indian Puranic record, in the Purans, there is testimony that yes, somewhere around this period onwards, the Shaka or Scythian tribes, the Hunas or the Hun tribes, etc., begin to invade into India. So the Aryan gene also does not really hold water. Anyway, that same haplogroup is not found in Mycenaean Greeks. It should be found because they were also descendants of the PI people. It's not found in Zoroastrian priests, but it should be found because they were also Aryan descendants from the same linguistic unity. So these are discrepancies in it. And anyway, if we want to play this game, we can always reverse it. So we know that Australian ancestors in the distant past lived in the Indian subcontinent. There is a deep paternal haplogroup which is spread all over East Asia, which has its origins in India. We have maternal groups prominent in Japan with their origins in India. We know there's a clade called F that it originated in India, and India was a prehistoric thoroughfare. And even R1, its own ancestors, R and Q, came from a P haplogroup, which also had its origins in India. So now do we start playing the same game and going and telling the Japanese that no, some of you are Indian origins and some of you are later invaders and so on and so forth. So it's an example of how if you want to start doing the genetic game, the knife cuts both ways, but it shouldn't cut anyway because genetics and linguistics do not correspond congruently. So again, on genetics, a sober analysis of the field will highlight that much of the methods and conclusions are driven by selective data, arbitrary methods, and flawed interpretations. Just some tables, I'm going to conclude now. If we look at the archaeological record, there is evidence against any kind of invasion or migration into India. We haven't found any archaeological evidence of it. We know there is unbroken continuities from the Bronze and Iron Ages. The skeletal and cranial record in India shows no break after 4500 BCE. We have horse remains, we have fire altars, etc., predating the Aryan, so-called Aryan arrival, and even the chariot has now been found. What is consistent with an out-of-India model? So there are clear markers of invasion across Europe. In Europe, we do know that a population did come from the east and suppressed linguistically and culturally an existing prior population. I've told you about the Bos indicus and Bos taurus. I've told you about the domesticated mouse. So there is evidence that's well aligned with OIT. So when we reject AI or migration theory, we're not denying human migration. We're not denying PIE. We're specifically denying the foreign origins of Sanskrit and Vedic culture and the spreading of this outside linguistic or academic boundaries into some kind of real sociological or historical commentary in modern India. The real European invasion is documented, so we do know what an Aryan invasion looks like. We just don't see it in India. And this whole theory, anyway, it was a theory of invasion, became a migration. There's a theory of tourism as well, as I told you. And if PI originated in India, then the dispersals were outward, which means that Sanskrit was, of course, homegrown. And the civilizational continuity of India is well established, even in archaeology. So even if genetically some people came in 1500 BCE or after, they came into a boiling pot, which was the Dharmic or Indian or Hindu boiling pot for thousands of years already, regardless of who they were. So some final takeaways. I want you to take away this at least, that it is a linguistic question at heart. It has attracted genetic, archaeological, ethnic layers, but without adequate foundation. The mainstream scholarship itself is inconclusive. Its own leading voices admit that the reconstruction cannot currently give us precise answers. And out of India theory models exist which satisfy the preservation principle. They match internal Rigvedic chronology and they are consistent with the archaeological record. Genetics cannot serve as a linguistic model because language and genes do not travel together. So what is needed actually is just some intellectual honesty when we look at all of the evidence on the table. So that's it. I'll take questions as well, but I also just wanted to share. I've written a book on ancient Indian history. Anyone who is interested could take a look at it. And about my organization, please take a look at our website, both research, and you can also find us on Twitter. Yeah,
Thank you, Amritanshu. That was quite illuminating.
I had to rush towards the end. I'm sorry
Yeah,
for
and
that.
I could see that, but I think it was necessary to cover all the points it did to provide the level of uh, to provide that comprehensive and nuanced overview. And I think it's, as you said consistently throughout, that none of these are, at this point in time at least, completely settled questions. There, from what I've heard from you, there seems to be much more of a OIT in play here versus an AIT or even AMT, as has been the popular discourse in academia and outside. Let's take some questions from the audience as well. If there are any questions from the audience, you can type your questions in the question box. But let me start by a question that revolves around, you mentioned the Greek civilization, and it perhaps was also a daughter to this PIE culture. Um, and the Europeans certainly, and of course, by extension, Americans as well. Europeans often regard Greek civilization as a foundational precursor to their own, um, and Roman and so on afterwards. In historical and civilizational terms, should the Greek civilization be understood as distinctly European or as a parallel and probably sister civilization to India?
So that's a great question, Sanjay ji, and actually it helps us understand how these things cut and dissect. So, for example, today, genetically, the Greeks are the closest probably to the Turkish people, at least in the western part of Turkey. But culturally, these nations are at odds. They have 800 to 900 years of historical issues and conflicts between them. There is a religious conflict between them as well. So, and the other part of Greeks were genetically very close to the Europeans above them, Bulgaria, Albania, etc. But if we are asking ourselves that from a cultural and let us say the spirit of a civilization point of view, then who are the descendants of the Greeks and in what ways? Certainly, Renaissance era and beyond, European philosophers can claim some descent from the Greeks because, in some ways, all of European philosophy is a dialogue with Aristotle and Plato. And, it's Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. So, yes, in that sense, they can claim some kind of philosophical descent or a relationship. But if we look at the culture and civilization of Greece as a whole, number one, it was a polytheistic civilization. They had so many different gods, temples to different gods. The same person might worship one god on one day for one purpose, might worship another god on another day for another purpose. Now, what modern civilization reminds us most of that? That would be the Indian or the Hindu civilization. So in that sense, in terms of how the Greeks, also developed their art, how they developed their mythologies, let's call them. There anyway, people have drawn enough parallels between the Odyssey and the Mahabharata, for example, between the tale of Troy and the tale of even the Ramayana, for example, where a wife is abducted and then an invasion happens. There are superficial comparisons and very deep comparisons as well. So clearly, in that sense, the Greeks and the Indians are more from some same similar descent than let us say post-pagan or post-Christian European.
So, thank you, and I know we are out of time. On behalf of the Sanatan Dharma Group, we're grateful for your time and insights. A recording of this call will be available in the next 48 hours. The topic of our next presentation is Dharma, Health, and Leadership, an Ayurvedic lens on purpose, performance, and well-being, to be delivered by Dr. P. Ram Manohar on March 12th at 7 a.m. PST, 7:30 p.m. IST. We look forward to continuing our exploration and learning with all of you. Namaste.
Thank you.
Thank you.